Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we're going to dive into a channel that, as far as I'm aware, I have never done a reaction to before, but I've had a lot of people suggest that I should. And as I've browsed the content on the channel, it does seem to be right up my alley with my interest in the history of the British monarchy. And we talk all the time about different lenses through which we can view history, and one of those lenses is through the connections that exist between the royal houses of Europe, especially when we're talking about something like World War I. Because, of course, you're dealing with monarchs in these various empires and kingdoms that are all related to each other through sometimes multiple different ways. So, for example, you have the king in the UK who is a grandchild of Queen Victoria, as is Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany and the Tsarina of Russia. They're all three grandchildren in the same family, and they find themselves on opposite sides in the war. So with that in mind, we're headed over to History Tea Time with Lindsay Holiday for the first time. I love seeing women in the kind of history creator space of YouTube. We don't have enough of that, and I think that they have a unique opportunity to give us a different angle on some things, just because men and women sometimes see things differently and think differently. So I'm interested to dive into this. This is actually part one of a 3-part series. So if you want to see the next 2 parts, please hit that like button, leave a comment, and let me know that this is something you want to see more of. And if the video does well, we'll definitely take a look at the next 2 parts in the coming days. So let's go ahead and dive into this one. The link's in the description.
Queen Victoria's grandchildren. Part 1. The children of Victoria and Edward. Queen Victoria's 9 children gave her 42 grandchildren.
42 grandkids? Wow, I knew she had a lot, but I didn't realize there were 42 of them. My grandfather's one of 50 grandchildren in the extended Maori family. There were 12 children in my great-grandfather's family, 11 boys and a girl. And my grandpa was actually the last living grandson in that family when he passed a couple years ago.
Among their ranks were a king, an emperor, 6 queens, 2 married couples, an embarrassing number of Nazis.
2 married couples, first cousins who married each other, who were already descended from people who were related to each other. This is like multiple layers of inbreeding happening here, and it had been for centuries.
And many captivating characters. They fought on both sides of world wars and spanned 122 years.
Look at that incredible picture. I mean, right there you've got Victoria. There's her future grandson, George V, right there. I think we've got Wilhelm II right there. I'm just looking to see who else I recognize. I'm sure we've got the Tsarina of Russia in here. Goodness gracious, all kinds of incredible things going on in that picture.
Of history. The first, Wilhelm, being born in 1859, and the last, Alice, dying in 1981.
That's crazy.
Today, of the approximately 28 monarchies that still survive throughout the world, 5 are occupied by descendants of Victoria. As briefly as possible, here are the stories of Queen Victoria's 42 fascinating grandchildren. The children of Victoria. Queen Victoria's eldest child and namesake married Frederick, heir to the throne of Prussia. They had 8 children.
And just an interesting point, Queen Victoria's first name was Alexandrina. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria, but as was often the case, they didn't always go by their first names. King Edward VII, his first name was Albert, but Albert sounded a little bit too German at a time when there was kind of a rivalry going on with the Germans.
As was royal custom, the elder children were raised by governesses and tutors and were not close to their parents. But after a family tragedy, Victoria raised the younger children herself. Following the unification of Germany, Frederick and Victoria became emperor and empress. Wilhelm II was born during a difficult delivery which resulted in nerve damage in his left arm.
And that's why anytime you see pictures or video, especially video, of Kaiser Wilhelm, you always see that one arm that's either got something in his hand or it's tucked behind him. It's always really easy to tell it's him because you see that one arm that doesn't move.
The limb was paralyzed and several inches shorter than the right. His mother was ashamed of having a disabled child and showed him little affection. She pushed doctors to cure him, resulting in years of torturous experimental treatments, including painful braces, electroconvulsive therapy, and even having dead animals strapped to his arm. Rather than curing his affliction, the results were a deeply traumatized young man who learned to hate his mother. His parents were outspoken liberals, so Wilhelm became deeply conservative and anti-Semitic. Wilhelm married Princess Augusta Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg, and Oxtenburg, and they had 7 children. He became Emperor or Kaiser of Germany at the age of 29.
And if you're not already familiar, Kaiser is just the German form of the Latin word, which basically is the same. When we say Caesar in English, but Kaiser is a lot closer to how they would have said it at the time. And so that's why you get Tsar and you get Kaiser. And the term Kaiser was also used by the Austro-Hungarians.
He in turn was strongly disliked by many members of his family, including kings of the United Kingdom, Edward VII and George V. Wilhelm frequently made tactless and alarming statements to the public. He was ruthless in his plans to build Germany up as a dominant world power and alienated many other European nations, particularly France. Wilhelm allied Germany with Austria-Hungary and offered military support during the crisis of July 1914.
That said, he then goes on vacation. And when he comes back and realizes that Serbia has basically relented on like 9.5 of the 10 things that were demanded of them, he says, well, there's no reason for there to be a war then. So while, yes, he kind of gave Austria-Hungary a blank check, he also, had he been present for that whole crisis, might have been able to avert it and even tried. Him and his cousin, Nicholas II, who a lot of people mistake the relationships that exist between these warring houses in Europe. Nicholas and George V of the UK and Tsar Nicholas II, they're actually related through their mothers who were sisters, whereas George and Wilhelm are both grandchildren of Queen Victoria, as is Nicholas's wife. Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm are actually related a little more distantly. It's back a couple more generations.
Which resulted in the outbreak of World War I. He built up the Navy, putting the dreaded U-boat into wide use. U-boat attacks on civilian ships, particularly the Lusitania, on which 1,198 lives were lost, as well as the interception of the Zimmerman note offering Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Mexico if they would attack the United States, outraged the American people and got the U.S. to enter the war.
That said, and I've said this before, it was an understandable line of thinking for the Germans. There was a British blockade of imports to Germany during the First World War, which was starving the German people. And in the German mind, and I think they were correct in this, the U-boats were doing the same thing. They were creating their own blockade by sinking ships that were coming in to the UK, many of which were carrying munitions to the UK, like the Lusitania. Lusitania had military munitions on board that ship, and the Germans had announced ahead of time a warning to passengers boarding ships that were going into that region, that exclusion zone, that they were potentially going to come under fire. And for a long time, the U-boats actually would stop unarmed ships like the Lusitania and warn them, listen, we're going to sink you. You have time to get everything off board. That's the way it used to be. But then what was happening was they were surfacing, they were trying to do that, and they would get fired upon. So then they just started sinking ships. It's terrible on both sides what was happening. A lot of civilians ended up paying the price for it.
Following the defeat of Germany in 1918, the monarchy was abolished and Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands. In 1939, he wrote Hitler to congratulate him on the invasion of Poland and to express his hopes that his monarchy would be restored. Wilhelm died in 1941.
Yeah, he never returned to Germany because he refused to return to Germany until the monarchy was restored. And of course, that never happened.
Charlotte had a difficult relationship with her mother. She was a troublemaker and enjoyed spreading gossip. At 17, she married Prince Bernhard of Saxe-Meiningen, who had a weak personality and was easily bent to her will. They had one daughter, Theodora, who was often left in the care of relatives while...
So there's a great picture there. You got 4 generations. You have Victoria, and then her daughter Victoria, and her granddaughter, and her great-granddaughter. That's a cool picture.
Her mother enjoyed a dazzling social life. When her brother became emperor, Charlotte was known for her mischief-making and frivolous lifestyle. Bernhard and Charlotte lost their duchy at the end of World War I. Charlotte died a year later at 59. It is possible that she suffered from porphyria, the genetic illness which may have caused the madness of her great-great-grandfather, King George III.
Yeah, they've talked about that, and that's one of those genetic things, like hemophilia, which got passed down and caused a lot of the issues for the family, the Romanovs, with the future Tsar, Nicholas II's son. That was also something that was passed down through many of Victoria's family.
Henry married his first cousin, Princess Irene of Hesse. The pair had 3 sons, 2 of whom suffered from hemophilia.
There you go.
Henry was a lifelong naval officer and became Grand Admiral of the German Navy, furthering his brother's ambitions for maritime dominance.
And this is something that ran in that extended family too. Naval service was very common. The future George VI was a gunnery officer on board the HMS Collingwood at the Battle of Jutland.
Henry left the Navy after the defeat of Germany in World War I. He died at 66. Sigismund impressed his mother with his intelligence from an early age, and she had high hopes for him. When his father went to war with Austria, every available doctor in Prussia went with him. While away, 21-month-old Ziggy fell ill with meningitis, and his mother was unable to find a doctor to save her child or treat his suffering. Victoria was haunted by grief and regret for the rest of her life. Following this tragedy, she played a much bigger part in the lives of her surviving children. Victoria was devoted to her mother and...
You notice the German spelling with the K.
...embraced her Englishness. She fell in love with Prince Alexander of Bulgaria, but her grandfather, Emperor Wilhelm I, refused to let the couple marry for fear of offending Russia. She instead married Prince Adolf of Schaumburg-Lippe, but the marriage was childless. He died during World War I. In 1927, 61-year-old Victoria married Alexander Zobkov, a 26-year-old Russian dancer.
Whoa, 26! She had a thing for the Russians, didn't she? And she was going to get her hands on a 20-something Russian, even if she had to wait till her 60s to do it. Dang.
He squandered what little money Victoria had left and rarely spent time with her. She was forced to auction off her palace and possessions and move into a one-room apartment. She intended to divorce Alexander, who had been deported because of his scandalous behavior, when she died of pneumonia at 63.
These grandchildren don't have long lifespans, do they? I mean, 50s and 60s, they're all dying. I mean, Kaiser Wilhelm lived a little longer than that.
Waldemar was a favorite of his parents. He was bright, lively, and loved animals. Once while visiting his grandmother, Queen Victoria, he let loose his pet crocodile in her office, shocking the Queen.
Dude, let a crocodile loose in Queen Victoria's office. That's fantastic.
Waldemar died at the age of 11 during the same diphtheria epidemic that killed his Aunt Alice and cousin Marie.
Diphtheria is not a disease we talk a lot about, but it caused a lot of childhood death. In my own family, I have a massive portrait of my grandmother's oldest brother. His name was Tommy Whitaker. He was born in 1915. My grandma's second oldest brother, Uncle Ralph, was born in 1916. And in 1917, they both got diphtheria. But Tommy died from it, and Uncle Ralph survived. And so Tommy only lived to 2. And, of course, diphtheria is one of the things that we get vaccinated for now, but it was a big, big problem.
Sophia married Prince Constantine, heir to the throne of Greece. She had a difficult time adjusting, but eventually learned to love her new country. She was active in improving the medical care of soldiers during the wars Greece fought at the turn of the century, founding hospitals and overseeing the training of nurses. But her ties to Germany made Greeks suspicious of her during World War I. Now king, Constantine was neutral in the war, but was deposed by the French in favor of his son, Alexander, who would join Greece with France, the UK, and Russia against Germany. Sophia and her husband went into exile in Switzerland.
Allies are all about self-determination unless you determine wrong, and then we'll determine for you. That's what happened there. I wonder if Sophia is the line through which, because I know Prince Philip, who's King Charles's father, was also a descendant of Queen Victoria, and I know he was Greek, from the Greek royal family, so I'm curious to know if this was the line he's descended from. So I looked it up. No, Philip actually comes through the line of Alice, who is a different daughter of Queen Victoria, and then through her daughter Alice, so it would be a grandchild named Alice. But it is a Greek line.
Alexander died in 1920 at the age of 27. His father was allowed back as king, only to lead Greece to defeat against Turkey and be forced to abdicate yet again in favor of his son George. In 1924, Greece was declared a republic and the family was once again exiled. Sophia died in 1932, aged 61. In 1935, George was reinstated as king of Greece. Upon his death, his brother Paul succeeded him. Paul's daughter Sophia married King Juan Carlos I and became Queen of Spain.
There you go.
She is the mother of the current king, Felipe VI.
So there's where we see that line. That's really cool. I'm glad she's kind of throwing that in there to give us the further down the line thing.
Margaret, the baby of the family, was the most well-liked by her siblings and maintained relationships with many of her cousins throughout Europe. She married Prince Frederick Charles of Hesse, and they had a happy marriage and 6 children, including 2 sets of twins. In 1917, Finland won its independence from Russia and elected Frederick as their new king. He was forced to renounce the throne 2 months later when Germany lost World War I. 2 of Margaret's sons...
We'd like a German to be our new king. Oh, you lost? Oh, never mind. We changed our mind about that.
Were killed in the war.
There you go. And that's something, sometime I'm going to just do a video on all the members of these royal families who died in the First World War, and many of them in the Second World War. We think of this as being like, the royal families all made these decisions and then sent all these commoners off to die, but they had skin in the game too. And a lot of them, I've mentioned this one before, but you have, first of all, not even just royal families. The Prime Minister of the UK, Herbert Asquith, his son was killed at the Somme. And you have the brother of the future Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, who was the mother of Queen Elizabeth II. Her brother was killed in the war. And there were other members of the British royal family who died as well. German royal family, same thing.
During World War II, she lived at her mother's castle, Friedrichshof, where she cared for many of her grandchildren while their parents were involved in the war. 2 of her sons joined the Nazi Party, hoping that Hitler would reinstate the German monarchy. One son, Philip, was on Hitler's personal staff, but became disenchanted with the Führer and used his position to provide passports for Jews escaping Germany.
Good for him.
When he was discovered, he was sent to a concentration camp. He survived, but his wife perished.
Yeah, I think some of the... I'm trying to think of which members of the royal family it was, but there were members of the different royal houses of Europe who ended up being held at places like Dachau. I think I mentioned one of them in my video on Dachau.
After the war, Margaret buried her family jewelry in the basement of Friedrichshof before being forced to flee when the castle was occupied by the U.S. military. American officers discovered the jewels and stole them. Margaret died in 1954 at the age of 81.
She lived 81.
The children of Edward. Victoria's heir married Alexandra of Denmark.
Uh-oh, look out. The first one's Jack the Ripper.
Edward was a legendary playboy and had some 55 mistresses, so it is quite probable that he added some illegitimate children to his prudish mother's family.
One of his most famous mistresses was a woman named Alice Keppel, who's the great-grandmother of Queen Camilla.
None were ever recognized. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, he became Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom. His 6 legitimate children were: Albert Victor, second in line to the throne, was 13 when he and his brother George were packed up on board the HMS Britannia to be educated as naval cadets. They traveled the world, and Albert's charm made him popular overseas. As he grew, he became a playboy like his father. He was twice embroiled in scandal, once when a homosexual brothel was discovered by police and Albert's close friend was exposed as a client. Later, it was speculated that Albert might have been Jack the Ripper.
He wasn't.
A serial killer who mutilated 5 prostitutes in London and was never identified.
Had a total alibi for that. It's impossible for him to be Jack the Ripper.
Albert was almost certainly not culpable in either case. He became engaged to Mary of Teck, but died of influenza shortly before the wedding.
So, interesting thing here, because we have a parallel to what happened with the story of Henry VIII, where Henry VIII had an older brother who was in line to be the king. He was the Prince of Wales. And he marries Catherine of Aragon, and then he dies. And so Catherine of Aragon then instead marries Prince Henry and becomes his queen when he becomes king. And so you have Prince Albert here, he's not the Prince of Wales yet because his father's Prince of Wales, but he is next in line to the throne after his father. And then when he dies, she ends up marrying his younger brother.
He was 28. For many years, the popular line on Albert was that he was a wastrel who lacked intelligence and that the UK dodged a bullet, never having him as king. But this story has recently been considered as propaganda coming from his brother, George V. Albert certainly struggled under an abominable tutor who tried to cover up his own shortcomings by claiming the prince was a dull student.
But there's also talk of him having syphilis and things like that.
However, shortly before his death, the Prime Minister intended to appoint Albert as Viceroy of Ireland, a position requiring tact and diplomacy. He was sympathetic to the Irish Home Rule movement, and he might have done a great deal for Ireland and all of the British Empire had he lived to wear the crown.
How would things have been different if he had ascended to the throne in 1910? Because his brother then is king when you have a lot of that stuff go down with Ireland in that first decade of his time as king. So what would have happened if it would have been Albert Victor instead?
George may or may not have been more intelligent than his older brother, but he was certainly more serious and boring. When Albert Victor died, George took his place in the line of succession.
That's a very rare photo of George without the beard, because he had that beard for like most of his life.
He also took his place at the altar and married his brother's fiancée, Mary of Teck, a notorious kleptomaniac. He became King George V of the United Kingdom in 1910 at the age of 44.
Mary of Teck was a kleptomaniac? What? I have questions. So if you've seen movies or TV shows like The Crown, then you've seen Mary of Teck portrayed in that. She's very prominent in the early episodes of that because, of course, she lives long enough to see her granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II, come to the throne. So this Daily Mail article says that she practiced upmarket kleptomania. In other words, she didn't just go into a store and slip something in her pocket, but if you had something she wanted, she would just demand that you hand it over. So Prince Olga, for example, Olga Romanov, said Mary of Teck had a kind of upmarket kleptomania because she would go stay in somebody's house and she'd be sitting on one of a dozen Sheraton chairs and say, "Ooh, I like this chair." And you'd be obliged to give her all 12. People got wise and they'd say, "Oh God, Queen Mary's coming to say." So they'd put the good stuff in the attic and bring more rotten stuff down. Outside church, she'd say, "I do like that fur coat," and you would have to give it over to her. Wow. I have never heard that before. That's incredible.
In 1914, George's cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, invaded France and Britain declared war on Germany. George made the prudent decision to renounce all his hereditary German titles. And
remember, the British royal family is heavily German at this point. Queen Victoria's husband was German. She has other German roots in her own line. So her children were very, very German. And even the house name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. And it should have been that same house name through Elizabeth II. Elizabeth II should have been the last monarch of the house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. And then it would have been a new house. It should be Mountbatten, or originally it was Battenberg, which is also German. They changed it to Mountbatten to make it sound more English.
Changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the more English-sounding Windsor. With so few monarchies left after World War I, George decreed that his children need not marry foreign royals.
So that picture there, that's the picture of the future King George VI and his wife, who was Scottish. They're not worrying about marrying foreigners anymore.
He signed the Home Rule Bill, making Ireland its own nation, and saw several other parts of the British Empire, including Australia, Canada, and South Africa, become legally independent. They are now the Commonwealth. They have their own governments, but the British monarch is still nominally their head of state. George died at 70 after 26 years on the throne.
1936.
The crown went first to his son Edward VIII, who abdicated in order to marry an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson, and then to his second son, George VI, who was an admirable leader of his people in World War II.
Dude was a boss, man. I really like George VI.
His daughter is the current Queen, Elizabeth II. Louise married Scotsman Alexander Duff, Earl of Fife, and her grandmother, Queen Victoria, promoted him to Duke of Fife. The couple had 3 daughters. The first was stillborn. In 1911, Louise and her family were sailing to Egypt when they were shipwrecked off the coast of Morocco. They survived the ordeal and were rescued, but Alexander contracted a chest cold which killed him a few weeks later. Louise died in 1931 at the age of 63. Victoria, known as Toria, was beautiful and had several suitors, including King Carlos I of Portugal. However, her mother discouraged her from marrying, and she instead remained a companion of her parents. When her mother died in 1925, Victoria moved to a country house in Buckinghamshire, where she got involved with village life and was president of the local horticultural society. Maud was a tomboy and was called Harry by her family. She married her first cousin, Prince Carl, the second son of the King of Denmark. In 1905, the Norwegian Parliament dissolved their union with Denmark and offered the crown to Carl, who became King Håkon VII. Maud thrived in her role as Queen Consort of Norway. She was very involved in charity work, especially benefiting children and animals, and became a fashion icon with a very slim corseted waist.
Holy cow.
The family embraced the Norwegian lifestyle and learned to ski. Maud died at 68 while visiting the UK. Through her only child, Olaf V, she is the grandmother of the current King of Norway, Harald V.
Cool.
Alexander John was born prematurely and died 24 hours after being born. Edward placed his infant son in his coffin personally, with tears rolling down his cheeks. In the next episode, we'll meet the children of Alice and Alfred. Among them, a Tsarina of Russia whose dependence on mystic Rasputin contributed to the fall of the Romanov dynasty, and a queen of Romania who helped to bring her country together.
Nice. That was good. That was really well done. I even liked the little preview of part 2 that we got there. So I really did enjoy that. I hope you guys did as well. So let me know your thoughts about that. And please hit that like button and leave a comment about something you learned in that you thought was interesting, or add something to the conversation. And we'll dive into parts 2 and 3 in the days ahead. Thanks for watching.